Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Wednesday, and that means Epic Comic Book Wednesday, when Michael K Vaughan and I combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comic books on which we have wasted our youths. Or at least that's what it usually means. But last week, I was under the weather and did not participate in Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Michael went it alone. And this week, he is talking about something that he knows does nothing for me whatsoever. He's a huge fan of EC Comics, and he decided to talk about EC Comics. Now, not DC Comics, but EC Comics, horror comics. And his video is a perfect example of the kind of split vision that BookTube often induces in me, because EC Comics has never had a better, more knowledgeable, more heartfelt tribute than his video. I'll leave a link to it down below. But Michael knows perfectly well, he knows perfectly well that I have nothing like that to say about EC Comics myself, just nothing at all. I could poke fun at him saying, apparently with a straight face, that EC Comics is the greatest comic book company of all time. EC Comics never once in their entire length of time as in the industry published any adventures of even a single Kryptonian. But nevertheless, he maintains that. But I'm perfectly willing to admit, especially after having watched his video, it really is a symphony of geekish enthusiasm. I'm perfectly willing to admit that they can be great, that they are great, but what am I supposed to say about a horror comic imprint, for Pete's sake? Unfortunately, there is a solution. Before we recombine forces next week, before we launch right into the genuine force of Epic Comic Book Wednesday next week, there is a solution this week, which is for me to make up for lost time and do the video that I missed last week. Last week, Michael talked about the Rocketeer. He showed a big, beautiful, oversized slipcase hardcover omnibus edition that is kind of enviable in a way. And he talked a lot about this comic book, which was created by Dave Stevens in the 1980s, and it is about a stunt pilot or a barnstormer or a roustabout, a general all-purpose Hal Jordan type figure named Cliff Secord, who discovers a futuristic jetpack that, once he masters it, allows him to fly and maneuver and have all sorts of adventures as a helmeted character called the Rocketeer. And in the comic, the great payoff in the comic, as you'll see if you watched Michael's video, the great payoff in the comic is who created the backpack. The backpack was created by Doc Savage. And that is a Dave Stevens tipping his hat, as he does all throughout this thing, to pulp adventures of the 30s, to the stuff that he really loved in a geekish kind of way. And there were only a couple of Dave Stevens' real masterpieces where he was a very meticulous artist, did beautiful, beautiful work. But he was very meticulous and very slow. And so there isn't a whole lot of original Rocketeer work. At first, I thought the idea of a hardcover omnibus is a little silly. There's so little of it. But of course, other artists have come on board, caught up in his vision, and gladly done artwork to add to it. The omnibus edition is full of other great artists. And I was sorry, of course. I apologized to Michael for missing last time, and I was flat on my back. There was no way that I could do it. And he mentioned that he wanted to talk about EC Comics this week to me, and I was just sort of nonplussed. I mean, that's as far away from the 30th Century Clubhouse as you can get. And he mentioned in a Voxer conversation that it'd be just fine by him if I actually did a video on the Rocketeer, if I don't let that go by. And I think I know why he wanted me to do that. He's never going to make that request about EC Comics to me. He's never going to say, gee, I'd have loved to hear what you had to say about EC Comics. He's never going to do that. And I think I know why he wants me to do it on Rocketeer, because I think on one level he knows we have very, very different tastes when it comes to comic books, but I think he knows on one level that it's not possible for me to dislike this thing. Not on the fundamental existential ways that I often dislike things that he likes. No, it's not possible for me to do. The Rocketeer, in its very limited iteration as the brainchild of Dave Stevens, is brilliant. It is a brilliant doff of the hat Indiana Jones style, to the raucous adventures of the pulp era. And he's right. There's no way that I can look at those issues and dislike them. There's also no way that I can dish dirt. For a long time, since the very sexy 1980s, I have known someone in the industry, nowadays a fairly prominent someone in the industry, and he has told me what I already suspected from the ye olden days when I used to go to comic book conventions, which is that no one in the industry had a single negative word to say about Dave Stevens. Everyone liked him. Everyone was frustrated by him because he marched very much to the beat of his own drummer. He could have been eye-wateringly wealthy, and he wasn't. He could have come up with 20 concepts like the Rocketeer. He could have done that. He was that way. I've heard he was that way in conversation, where ideas and inspirations would spark in every direction. But he didn't. He was a slow-moving perfectionist with a very clear idea of what he wanted to do. So I can't dish the dirt about how he drowned puppies or anything like that. All I can do is agree with Michael K. Vaughan that the Rocketeer is brilliant. And if you are absolutely sold on the concept, well, then this big, complete anthology collection, the one that Michael shows off in his video, is probably money well spent for you. A lot of you will know this concept not so much from the comics, but the comics have always been a niche specialty affair when it comes to the Rocketeer. He's always had a small, devout cult following, sort of like a much smaller version of the fan response to Mike Mignola's Hellboy. Probably if you know about this character, you will know about this character from the 1991 movie, directed by Joe Johnston. And you might not have fond memories of that movie. God knows I don't. Dave Stevens put his best face on it when the movie was in production, and especially when it came out. He put his best face on it. Even when there was Hollywood money on the line, he had to be his own self. He didn't just get out in front of cameras on carpets and say, "This is unqualifiedly great. I am so humbled to see my vision brought to life on the big screen," etc., etc. Instead, he said, I don't remember his exact quote, but it was some sort of percentage game. He just said, "It's mostly good." Because even then, he couldn't bring himself to just sell out for money, which might have made a difference. Although, I don't think it would have saved this movie. The Rocketeer, Michael K. Vaughan is probably going to recoil at this, but the Rocketeer movie is bad. It's poorly paced. The number one thing wrong with it is its poor pacing, where it will have jolt-up moments and then endless amounts of stuff that you just have to wade through before you get to another jolt-out moment. When the whole idea of a character that looks like that, the whole idea of a reckless barnstormer, a sexy reckless barnstormer who finds a futuristic jetpack, is that there aren't any sloggy bits. There aren't any. It's all enticing. It's all exciting. Well, you'd have to be a pretty swallow the Kool-Aid Rocketeer fan to think that the Rocketeer movie from 1991 is all exciting. It's not. It has so many things wrong with it. And that's to say nothing of the fact that the industry gossip was that the studio suits wanted to redesign the Rocketeer himself, the central visual character, who was visually designed by a visual genius. Dave Stevens, what you might think of his business acumen or even his social skills or his romantic life, was clearly a visual genius. You don't mess around with that sort of thing. That's a large percentage of what he's selling to Hollywood is the visuals of the Rocketeer. That didn't happen. The visuals were largely kept intact, but I'm not talking about the visuals. The visuals are just about the only thing that the movie does right. Other than that, it's a disaster. On almost every level, it's a disaster. Starting with the thing that I think probably broke it at the box office. Probably it could have succeeded a lot better than it did. Well, it would have succeeded a little bit better than it did if you'd got its effing creator to say that it was 100% effective instead of 35% effective with 70% chance of meatballs or whatever it was that he said. And he said it over and over again. He went on interviews over and over again at conventions and said, "Yeah, it's mostly good. I mostly like it." That's not what you're supposed to say. But the main thing that hurts the movie, the main thing that hurts it as a viewing experience is the pacing. Good luck not being bored during your first viewing of The Rocketeer. But the main thing that hurt the movie in the box office was its lack of box office. It has no star. The director, for some god unknown reason, decided to go with a D-rate Hollywood celebrity named Billy Campbell, who not only can't act, He bears a slight squint in the right direction, and you might see it resemblance to Dave Stevens and Cliff Secord, the main character in The Rocketeer. He looks a little bit like a 1940s serial action movie hero, a little bit like that if you squint just a little, but he can't act. And he's deathly afraid of flying. And you're hiring him to play the Rocketeer. Do you think that's not going to be visible in the wire work when he's doing his flying scenes? It very much is. It very much is. It ruins the whole movie to put a nobody in that main role. There are a whole bunch of bankable action stars, bankable Hollywood figures who were certainly in talks. A couple of them were geekish enough to actually want the role of Cliff Secord. And Joe Johnston passed right over them. For that matter, Timothy Dalton is in the movie. He's the villain. He's the literal mustache-twirling villain in the movie. And it's a good, juicy part in its way. It's got a couple of good lines. Any Hollywood actor will tell you they'd much rather be the villain than the hero because they get to choose scenery. They get good, juicy lines. But at the time this movie came out, Timothy Dalton was James Bond. Why not cast him as the Rocketeer? Why not do that? A slight alteration, and he would have been a passable Cliff Secord, and he had star power. He might have got butts in seats. He might have got people to go and see the movie, which is kind of the goal of making a Hollywood movie, is that you want people to go and see it. But instead of casting any of those other people with name recognition, some people with name recognition, even Johnny Depp, I don't know how that would have worked, but it might have worked. You never know. What was that? A lot of you will know better than I will. What was the name of that movie with Divine in it? Where was it? Crybaby? That movie's box office, it made a marginal amount of box office. It certainly didn't do its box office on the back of devoted Divine fans, vocal though we were. It didn't do it there. It made the limited amount of box office that it did at all because of Johnny Depp, because he was the star. Something like that for The Rocketeer might have saved the movie. It might have made it a little better. Instead, you've got a weird niche comic book that was done perfectly. When Dave Stevens did Rocketeer, he did it perfectly. Never seen a better iteration. Michael K Vaughan in his video says that the first Rocketeer adventure by Dave Stevens in this anthology is pretty much a perfect comic book adventure stories. And you don't often hear me say this on Comic Book Wednesday, but Michael K Vaughan is absolutely right. He is absolutely right. It is a poem of a comic book. Just perfect. You won't have encountered it. Unless you go looking for it, you won't have encountered it. Maybe you should. Maybe your library can get you, maybe they bought into this Rocketeer omnibus. You might be able to find a reprint of an issue like that. A lot of Rocketeer stuff is very collectible, but a lot of it's not. So you might be able to, and you might see it. Not everybody who sees that first issue is going to see it. You have to be on the right wavelength. You have to be on Dave Stevens' wavelength. He was going for a very specific thing, and true to form, he did not care whether or not you got what he was going for. He hoped you would, but he wasn't going to help you at all. And if that's okay with you and you get what he was going for, you're going to love it. You're absolutely going to love it. And those of you who have your bat senses attuned to Steve, first of all, God help you. You should develop a really wholesome habit, but those of you who have your bat senses attuned to Steve are going to be hearing a but hovering over this whole video. And you're right. Now, Michael K. Vaughan wasn't saying that Joe Johnston's 1991 movie, The Rocketeer, was any great masterpiece. I think he and I, again, would probably agree 100% that Joe Johnston's Captain America movie, The First Avenger, is much better. Although I would argue that even Captain America, The First Avenger, shows Joe Johnston's weakness, his kryptonite weakness, every bit as much as Rocketeer does, and that is pacing. And that is pacing. The Captain America, The First Avenger is a great comic book movie. One of the best Marvel comic book movies. But it still has the problem with pacing. It has the same problem with pacing as The Rocketeer. Probably tamped down a little because probably for Captain America, The First Avenger, Joe Johnston had a whole bunch of reflective sunglass wearing suits from the studio looking over the dailies and saying, this hour-long period where people just talk, that has to go. Or you have to go. We'll just have you killed and slide your body into the La Brea tar pits the way we have the 10 directors before you. Probably that accounts for it, but you can still see him trying in that movie. That movie is infinitely more effective. If you haven't seen Captain America: The First Avenger and you're thinking, well, it's a superhero movie, so I won't like it. No, you should see it. You should see it. It's not only one of the most effective Marvel Comics superhero movies, but it has the best ending of any Marvel superhero movie. The ending hits you like a punch in the gut. The ending comes out of nowhere. For me, it came out of nowhere. Not the scene that it ends with, but the line that it ends with. I didn't see it coming. It was amazing. There's nothing like that in the 1991 Rocketeer movie. Now, it won't be that butt. That's not the butt hovering over this, because Michael and I are not disagreeing, I don't think, on the cinematic merits of the Rocketeer movie. No, the butt here that's hovering over this is purely personal. I'm perfectly willing to admit that. And I've already stated that Dave Stevens was a weird, quirky genius, could not hold on to money if it was stuck to his body. I can't fault him for that, because I can't either. But he could not, in an industry where no one's looking out for your future and you absolutely have to hold on to your money, he couldn't do it. Just couldn't do it. I've heard multiple stories about how fast his Hollywood advance was gone, but it was lightning fast. Faster than you could spend it, that's for sure. But I'm not faulting his original Rocketeer issue. It is a brilliant homage to the pulps. Now, I'm faulting the basic concept, and that is personal. I am perfectly willing to admit. And if you've watched a lot of Comic Book Wednesdays, you know how I'm faulting the basic concept, which is, put simply, who is Cliff Secord? Who is he? This kind of superhero conception drives me nuts. I never like it, no matter when it occurs, no matter how it occurs. Cliff Secord is a guy who finds a thing. That does not make him a hero. That does not make him a hero. Cliff Secord is a guy who finds a thing. When he loses a thing, he's back to being a guy without a thing. That is not true for Batman, who has no superpowers, just in case you all think this is a Kryptonian rant. That is not true for Batman. Batman is a hero. He doesn't play a hero. He doesn't need this thing in his vault in order to be a hero. He's a complex character who is a hero. Superman, you might think, is the ultimate dispositive example, because he gets his superpowers from coming from a planet far, far away. He gets his superpowers from simply being on Earth. But no, his superpowers don't make him Superman. It's his nature. It's his morality. It's the ingrained values imparted in him by the Kents in Smallville. The person is the hero, evidenced by the many, many Superman storylines in which he loses his powers on an alien planet or on Earth, and is still every bit Superman. Same thing with Wonder Woman. She's incredibly complex. She doesn't have a mother or a father, for Pete's sake. She's not a biological organism. She has a double calls on her personality as an ambassador with a mission of peace from an isolated warrior culture. She's fascinating whether she has her powers or not, whether you take her gimmicks away or not. Many DC writers have not seen that, but it's nevertheless true. Those three characters like that, in Marvel, I would say Thor, he is himself a hero, regardless of whether or not he has his hammer. And the hammer doesn't make him the hero. Whereas, well, what's a Marvel example? Well, the ready-made example for me is always a DC example, and that's Green Lantern. Hal Jordan is also a test pilot, like Cliff Secord, who finds a thing and suddenly becomes a hero. I don't like that. Same thing is true with Barry Allen, the Flash. He's just a schlep. He's not a hero. He's not virtuously fighting crime. He's not bleeding for the hearts of the innocent. Then something happens to him. It could have happened to you or me, and then suddenly he's doing that thing. So that bugs me. That kind of, I'm going to put on my superhero dumb the way I put on a suit and tie. That always bothers me. I want the person to be the hero, if that makes any sense at all. I probably, in order to get back to crawl back into Michael K. Vaughan's good graces, I should probably say that probably comes from Edgar Rice Burroughs. who, Tarzan, yes, sure, $80 billion property. But like a lot of people, I suspect, like Michael K. Vaughan, I fell in love with Edgar Rice Burroughs through John Carter of Mars. And you might think, well, no, John Carter is an example of the opposite of what you're talking about, because it's only his earthborn muscles that give him his superpowers on Mars. But no, A, we're told in A Princess of Mars that John Carter is strange anyway, that he was a weird immortal being before he went to Mars. And B, it's made perfectly clear in the novels that it's his character that makes him a hero. Especially since Edgar Rice Burroughs was not a particularly consistent writer and quickly forgot that John Carter of Mars had superpowers. Except when he needed them. He quickly forgot about them. It's his character that does it. That's what bothers me about The Rocketeer, is that unlike, for instance, the other niche character that I mentioned, Hellboy, he's a guy who finds a thing. And I know that's primal wish fulfillment for a whole bunch of dude bros out there who read this stuff and think, well, I'm a guy, I could find a thing. But it's never really worked for me. That is the essential disconnect between me and The Rocketeer, which otherwise is every bit as brilliant as Michael K. Vaughan says it is. So I'll link to his video down below, but that's the disconnect for me, is that kind of story never really works for me in a way that it does for other people. I'm perfectly willing to admit that it works for other people. It certainly is an absolute standard, narrative standard in the pulp adventure world, right? Flash Gordon. It certainly is a standard there. But again, if we go back to the pulp era, you've got your Flash Gordon, who's just an ordinary guy and wouldn't do any of these heroic things if he weren't pushed to do them. And then you've got Prince Valiant, who would. He's an inner heroic flame that can never be quenched. It's a discussion for another time. Maybe Michael and I could do a live stream and talk about these two different kinds of heroism. But who knows what we'll do next. I have no idea what we'll do next week. But next week, I'm hoping that the streams converge. I'm hoping that we combine to Epic Comic Wednesday next week and talk about the same thing at the same time. So I will wrap this up, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.